and all alone, confessing while alone and on, without a clue. But I'm a sharpshooter. What else should I be? Please don't take off my mask, revealing dark.
Let's just pretend this didn't take forever, shall we? The next arc almost immediately marks a jump in quality. Almost as soon as Madarame confesses, the writing begins to improve, with Yusuke suddenly becoming one of the most enjoyable and endearing members of the cast. The scene where he hands over the original Sayuri to Sojiro is especially endearing. It's a beautiful and subtle way to not only close out the emotional arc of his mother's death, but also demonstrate his respect and passion for art as a whole. He talks about the painting as though it's a living thing, before mentioning that he's sure the artist's intent was never for it to be a widely obsessed over masterpiece, but rather a beautiful yet humble work that brightens the day of everyone who happens to see it. As such, he feels more than comfortable giving away the only piece of art he has that was made by his mother in exchange for a room for the night and a cup of coffee, in an attempt to respect her, Sojiro, and the artwork itself. It's a nice little character moment that went a long way to undoing a lot of the damage caused by his train wreck of an introduction. Also, somewhere in the middle of all of this, the worst part of the game walks into the room. But we'll get to him later. You better fucking believe we're going to get to him later. For the time being though, let's turn our attention to the real protagonist of this arc, Makoto. Makoto is introduced fairly early on in the narrative as a minor antagonist, where she is being used as a tool by the powers that be to hound us under the threat of being denied a much-needed letter of recommendation by the principal. That might sound like a petty reason to spy on a group of kids, and to be fair, it kind of is. But let's not forget how competitive academics in Japan can be, especially if you're someone like Makoto who takes school very seriously. Over the course of Madarame's arc, she'll show up every so often to side-eye us, and if you're paying attention, you can catch her stalking you around Shibuya in the school, and Jesus Christ, look how adorable she is. She is so out of her depth on this kind of thing, but God bless her, she's trying to play the detective so hard, it's just precious. Up until this point, Makoto is somewhat obnoxious, but also understandable, and kind of endearing in her own way. However, any goodwill she cultivates goes out the window pretty quickly once she catches Ryujiing it up and yelling about how we're the Phantom Thieves and begins to blackmail us. This section proves to be some of the game's strongest writing, as well as a great counterpoint to the failures of Yusuke's intro. What they managed to pull off here is honestly impressive. The game has to give us just enough reason to kind of loathe Makoto for the time being so that we, the audience, feel at least okay with it when everyone in the party tells her to fuck off. However, they needed to do that in such a way that after the fact we could turn around and realize that while she may not have been cool about things, she ultimately didn't really do anything wrong. In short, the game needed to make us go,
am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong.
Am I wrong?
You're not wrong.
Makoto.
You're just an asshole.
Okay then.
and as far as I'm concerned, they nailed it. And the way in which they nail it is interesting. First off, while she is blackmailing us, she is blackmailing us into doing something that is not only a societal good, but also the kind of thing we'd want to do anyways. Taking down a mob boss is right in line with the kind of shit we've been doing as the Phantom Thieves since day one. Getting blackmailed isn't cool, but she's clearly not doing it for personal gain, cough Yusuke cough, but instead doing it to help random kids at the school. No one asked her to do this. The principal would probably have her head on a platter if he knew about it, given the connections to the big bad we discover later on, and it eventually winds up painting a massive target on herself as well. We may be grabbing the shit end of the stick that Makoto is handing us, but it's a stick that's about to be hurled straight at Kaneshiro. Holy shit, I'm good at analogies! Secondly, all of this is framed as her trying to figure out what the Phantom Thieves' powers and intentions are, which, may not be cool for us in the short term, but in hindsight it's kind of hard to blame her. After all, who among us, upon seeing a shadowy group made up almost exclusively of delinquents that claims to be able to steal people's hearts and seem to have the supernatural ability to actually follow through on those claims, wouldn't want to figure out what their deal is? To us, the Phantom Thieves are clearly benevolent and well-intentioned, but we think that because we are the Phantom Thieves. For a random member of the public, though, every part of what we are is kind of a scary idea. In turn, Makoto's skepticism of us is fairly well-founded. Finally, Makoto herself is not even kind of in a good place right now. It's sort of easy to not notice in the moment because we're probably pretty mad at her while it's happening, but on subsequent playthroughs it becomes really obvious that by the time she attempts to confront Kaneshiro, she is in the midst of a major emotional breakdown. Literally everyone in her life, the principal, Akechi, her sister, and us have told her that she's flat out useless, which ultimately results in her kind of totally losing her shit and throwing herself headfirst at Kaneshiro. Does she act rashly? Yeah, without question. Because she's in a mental place right now where she needs to, just for once, feel like she has some sort of say in her life and isn't just a puppet to be toyed with by everyone she knows. Makoto is a character with flaws. She can be rash, rude, elitist, and painfully naive. But she's also probably the member of our team who at the end of the day is the most committed to justice. Because she was the only member of our team who was pursuing it before she got her powers. She's the Phantom Thieves' answer to Steve Rogers. And the real beauty of all of this is even if you didn't recognize all or any of these factors, it's still easy to come back around to her side once all of this is past due to her giving an earnest and heartfelt apology to everyone involved. Going as far to go out of her way and apologize to Anne personally for insulting her and for failing to help Shiho. And just like that, they were able to take a character the audience probably mildly hated at first and turn them into one of the single most popular characters within the fandom. And I think that's a sleight of hand trick that is worthy of a bit of praise, especially after having watched them fuck it up once already. Also, she has by far the coolest persona in the entire series as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, it's kinda dumb, but it's my kind of dumb, and I want this Figma now. Speaking of personas, let's take an aside real quick to talk about Persona 5's core combat. It's good. It's really good. Like, really, really, really good. Like, I'd go as far as to say it might be the best combat in any traditional JRPG ever. Sit down, Nocturne fans. I know I will get to you. Like I said, it might be. In terms of mechanical depth, creativity, or just straight up quality, I can think of a handful of games that can seriously rival it. But in terms of how it feels to play in the moment with controller in hand, pressing buttons, and what those buttons cause to happen on screen, there is no traditional JRPG that can touch Persona 5. For my money, this is now the official starting point for people who aren't familiar with JRPGs trying to break into the genre. If you've ever been someone who disliked JRPG combat because it was boring, here's your olive branch. Gameplay-wise, this is now the most accessible game in its genre. Because while it may be a JRPG, it uses some basic yet clever tricks to make itself feel like an action game. And the way it accomplishes that kind of game feel is so shockingly simple that it's kind of mind-blowing that it isn't already the norm. It stripped its UI down to the bone. Most turn-based RPGs tend to have a problem with menus, namely that they tend to slow things down. Even the best of the genre suffer from this. I mean, let's just look at Persona 4 for example. It's a game that I personally would say has a really good combat system, but the menus are a little clunky to deal with. Let's take a common occurrence in gameplay to see what I mean. You just analyzed an enemy for a weakness, go to check if your current persona has a move that can exploit that weakness, realize it doesn't, then decide to switch personas to something that can exploit it, then go to skills and use that attack. In Persona 4, that is a minimum of 12 button presses. Now, you know what the minimum number of button presses to do the same thing in Persona 5 is? 3. I realize this sounds like a nitpick, but in this instance, streamlining makes all of the difference. Especially for a really common action you'll be performing dozens, if not hundreds of times over upwards of 80 hours of gameplay. The super minimal UI of this game allows the combat to flow much, much faster than it would otherwise, which in turn leads to the combat feeling much more involved, frantic, and fast-paced because interesting and challenging moments occur much more frequently as a result of the amped-up pace. However, it can still be run at the exact same speed it always has if the player decides to slow down, so the heart of the genre is still there. From here, the game sets out to make every action in those menus feel satisfying. With the exception of the item menu, every choice immediately results in something visually interesting happening. You attack, you pull out your gun, you summon your persona, basically everything has some kind of animation tied to it that serves to make it feel more dynamic. That's a word I want to focus in on, dynamic. Because that's what this game nails better than any other in its field. Something cool happens whenever you press a button. A cool menu pops up, a cool animation plays, all accompanied by cool sound effects. The whole setup is amazingly sleek and stylish, which all feeds back into the game's core tone. Because of all of these little touches, it can be easy to feel like an agile thief thinking quickly on their feet once you find a rhythm in a fight. In this way, its combat complements the rest of the game in a way that very few other JRPGs can claim. That being said, I don't want to give the impression that this game is all style and no substance, because that is certainly not the case. This is a Shin Megami Tensei game after all. Sure, they may have dropped the SMT moniker, but its blood still runs through its veins, and it shows. In terms of mechanics, Persona 5 undeniably has the SMT touch. This isn't by any stretch the deepest combat in the series. Again, I see you Nocturne fans, you can sit down, it will be okay, but it definitely has a lot to offer. The game sees the return of the nuke element from Persona 2, as well as the introduction of guns inside to add a few more things you need to ensure that your party has covered, as well to have to protect yourself against. Buffs are usually a good idea to throw on, but not mandatory on normal, at least till the later fights. However, if you're the type of person who insists that an SMT game has to be brutally difficult, you're probably also the type of person to play on hard from the get-go, where, yeah, it's pretty much mandatory. However, if you're the type of person who just wants to breeze through the game and experience the story, there are difficulty options for that too. This is a game that is incredibly eager to provide every player with whatever kind of experience they want, which I'm sure makes some people furious, but I'm not one of them. No matter what difficulty you play on though, the gameplay will get more complex as time goes on as a result of abilities being granted by different confidants, especially Oda and Hifumi's. The late game gun abilities are a lot of fun to play around with, and party member switching is frankly something that should have just been part of the core mechanics. But we'll talk more about that later. Also, there's assists. These were technically already a thing in the series by way of Persona 4 Golden, but I'm willing to bet that this was most people's introduction to them because Golden is still inexplicably trapped on the Vita. Anyways, the assists are fine. They're fine. They add a nice little element of randomness that makes fights a little more interesting and exciting when they happen, but they don't happen enough to where you can rely on them. They're a treat, nothing more, nothing less. I'll be talking more about the combat and fits and spurts over the course of the remainder of the series, but suffice to say that this is one area where Persona 5 undeniably crushes it. As I said before, there are games with deeper combat, more inspired combat, and maybe a few with just straight up better combat. But in regards to a JRPG that seamlessly melds style and substance, there's nothing out there I've ever seen that can come close to P5. For whatever failings Persona 5 might have elsewhere, this is one place where it truly innovates. If there's anything that all its peers should take from Persona 5, it's how it organizes its gameplay. Cause after this, I don't know if I have the patience anymore for trash UIs now that I know there's a better way. But let's get back to the core of what we're here to talk about, shall we? Kaneshiro's Palace is basically to this game what the original Thor is to the MCU. Really good for what it is, but at the end of the day, pretty forgettable due to the fact that it's neither particularly good nor particularly bad, especially given the average quality of the universe it belongs in. This palace's biggest weakness is also its biggest strength. The fact that it's a bank. The primary good of it is fairly obvious. It feeds exceedingly well into the thievery motif. After all, what is the most common and essential form of being a thief, if not robbing a bank? Beyond that, it provides an easy way to come up with traps and puzzles, as well as giving you a simple to follow artistic style for several very different looking locations. Most of all, it gives you a simple setup with a simple conclusion and a simple reward. Because you're robbing a bank. It's so incredibly obvious what's going to happen that it basically writes itself. On the downside though, it's all of those things. This level is easily, far and away, the most obvious, predictable, and unoriginal level in the game. It has no ideas, elements, or designs that make it its own. Every time I mentally go through all of the palaces from this game in my head, this is the one I always forget. To its credit though, it does manage to milk the idea of being a bank for all it's worth. There's a ton of shuffling through vents, dodging over lasers, avoiding security cameras, and eventually, a really nice code cracking puzzle that, yes, isn't really difficult, but it did make me bust out the old pen and paper for a minute, which I feel is worth some praise. And it does stand out as the one element of this level that I remember the most. Then again, I'm eternally impressed by any video game puzzle that manages to land anywhere above the difficulty of puzzles that ask you to put the square block in the square hole and then act like you're Aristophanes, yet also below the difficulty of puzzles that require you to either A, independently develop a new branch of calculus, or B, just say fuck it and keep pressing buttons till something happens. So take that for what you will. Also, this shot of the vault is really cool, even though the vault itself turns out to literally be the most sterile environment in the game. Because once you get in there, the game radically shifts from boring office hallways to a boring metal warehouse. It's literally the most basic design they could have gone with, and it just has no flavor to it. But like I said, all of this stuff comes back to the setting itself, because no matter how much interesting Persona stuff they throw on it, it is ultimately just a bank. Not a fantasy bank or a sci-fi bank or a bank with some kind of crazy artistic twist to it, it's just a simple, normal bank. Sure, this bank has shadows in it, but regular banks have guards, and functionally the two are identical. So all we really have here is just a bank. And real-life banks are boring. Name one cool bank. Go on, I'll wait. Now name one thing more boring than going to the bank. To the 5 or so of you who said playing Final Fantasy XIII, you got it right, well done, I'm proud of you, here's your gold star, enjoy. For the rest of you, I'm sorry to tell you, but you're wrong, because banks, by intentional design, are the most homogeneous and bland buildings on the planet. Banks deliberately decorate themselves with the safest and most inoffensive architecture, furniture, and decor humanly possible because they want literally every human being on the planet to be their customer. And the best way to do that is to make a place where no one feels unwelcome. This is the reason why 99% of heist movies take place in casinos. So when you're choosing where to draw influence from when making your bank set in a twisted manifestation of a person's psychology, which itself is set in your series that is filled with demons, gods, and Mara, maybe it's not the best idea to look at Wells Fargo and call it a day. Like, guys, the palace right before this one took the concept of a museum and by the end twisted it into a fantastical dreamscape filled with art. You'll know you could have done stuff like that here too, right? They could have done literally anything with this. They could have had you fly around on a dollar like a goddamn magic carpet or something, and instead they took the most uninspired approach with it possible. It's kind of a shame, especially since the core level design for the main bank is actually pretty impressive. It has an approach to its layout that is pretty clearly inspired by Metroidvanias, with locked doors looping back around to the center of the map creating shortcuts, usually right about the time you really wish you had some kind of bearing for where you're at or need to backtrack for whatever reason. Kamoshida's palace also had this, but to a lesser degree. Unfortunately, even this is kind of put to waste as a core design problem of Persona 5 at large begins to rear its head. If you've played this game, and you really should have by now, it's been forever, then you know you're able to fast travel between save rooms. In and of itself, this ability isn't inherently a bad one. It's certainly preferable to having to backtrack all the way from the beginning of the palace to wherever you last reached every time you leave and re-enter it, especially on more linearly designed levels like Madarame's. However, this means that some of the more cohesively designed palaces that have clearly had a lot of thought, time, and effort put into considering how they connect to themselves and crafting shortcuts kinda goes to waste. After all, why would I use this shortcut to get back to the basement of the bank when I could just teleport there? It seems like such a weird oversight to make in terms of design that part of me can't help but wonder if the fast travel ability wasn't something added until after they already made progress building some of the levels. Especially since both the second half of this palace as well as the next one feature a branches on a tree approach to design that gels much better with the fast travel mechanic. As is though, while the level design here is actually fairly impressive, it ultimately serves no purpose. This era of good ideas kind of gone to waste also extends to the boss fight with Shadow Kaneshiro. The aesthetic design of this fight is really strong. Shadow Kaneshiro's design is pretty revolting, and fighting a giant mecha piggy bank is exactly the kind of fight that only Persona as a franchise could ever get away with, and probably stands as the most fun and creative choice in the entire palace. The fight itself, though, doesn't hold up nearly as well. It's one that is made up of interesting mechanics that you don't really need to utilize or think about, at least not on normal. There's a bit of setup where Piggytron sort of acts as Kaneshiro's armor, not dissimilar to Shadow Mitsuru in Persona 4, which could have been really interesting, but since defeating either Piggytron or Kaneshiro wins you the fight, it feels more like a DPS race against whichever target you're given more time with or decide you'd rather focus on. You're given a chance to throw away a valuable item to distract him, but he doesn't output enough damage that getting a break from his attacks to recover would really be worth the cost of any item he'd care about. He spins on his Piggytron to run it over you, but it's so easy to cause enough damage punch to knock him off of it that I've never seen what the attack actually looks like. And it just goes on like that. I don't want to sound overly negative though, because this isn't a bad boss. It's just that it's ultimately a really basic one in a game filled to the brim with mechanically experimental fights. Of all of the shadow fights, this is the only one that never really forces your hand to manage something else or find a solution to a problem you don't have to deal with elsewhere in the game. As is, this is the only shadow where the entire fight is nothing more than the purest incarnation of the standard JRPG battle. Attack until you need to heal when you should, buff if you find time, don't sweat it if you want to just keep wailing on him. Rinse and repeat until you win. What's true about this boss is true about this palace as a whole. It does what it does really well, especially as far as basic JRPG fare goes. It has more going on than most games would even bother to attempt, and you'd be hard-pressed to find many other things in its genre with its level of craftsmanship. However, in terms of the standards that this series and this game in particular has set for itself, it's banal, ultimately turning out not to be creative enough to be exciting nor its own thing enough to stand out. Not challenging enough to feel satisfying, but not easy enough that you can simply breeze through it and get onto the fun parts without thinking about it. If Madarame's writing felt like it belonged in a free DLC, then this palace feels like the chunk of gameplay that should have accompanied it. And to be clear, there are worse things to be than what feels like fluff content for Persona 5, but there sure as hell are better things too. Lastly, let's take a look at a few more of the confidant, shall we? Specifically, I want to take a second to talk about Munehisa Iwai, Hifumi Togo, and Yuki Mishima. First things first, Iwai is a confidant arc that is a personal favorite of mine, and though it's flawed in its own way, probably stands as one of the stronger character arcs overall. For his part, Iwai himself is a stellar character. He fits firmly into the traditional archetype of the badass with the heart of gold, and sells it better than most. Upon meeting him, it's earnestly hard to tell where his story will go. It's made apparent right off the bat that he's involved in something pretty shady, especially if you know how tattoos are generally viewed in Japan. However, it's made equally apparent by his treatment of you that he has a soft spot for punk kids. As the narrative continues on, it becomes abundantly clear that even though he's involved with the Yakuza, he's one of the good ones, as it were. He's traditional, but only insofar as to maintain basic respect and honor, and always puts the safety of the people around him ahead of his own. All of this becomes doubly true once his son becomes involved and we learn what brought him to step away from the Yakuza. Hearing him talk about giving up his old life to provide a better one for a child he never asked for is undoubtedly one of the most human moments the game has to offer. And seeing him constantly fear what his son will think of him if he were to find out about his past goes a long way to humanizing Iwai and is another high point in this game in terms of character writing. Especially the scene where he coaxes us into escorting his son and we discover that Iwai got his neck tattoo not for the Yakuza, but to make his son feel more at ease with the scar on his neck. It's pretty apparent that Iwai's lived a hard life and doesn't want that for anyone else. So anytime he sees anyone who's headed down that path or just struggling at large, he does his best to help them out. Watching this gruff gangster try to connect with us and help us out is relentlessly charming. It makes him really hard not to love. This also manages to provide a really interesting alternate take on the theme of rebellion. I mean, what has Iwai been doing, not just here, but over the course of the past decade, if not rejecting the status quo in order to make the world a better place, even if only just for one person? Some people may disagree with this, but I'd personally argue that rebellion doesn't always have to be flashy. It doesn't have to involve taking people down or destroying the old. Sometimes rebellion can be simply living your life with empathy, day to day, in a way that the people who seek to control you say you shouldn't be, and we see that in Iwai. He leaves the Yakuza, an organization that famously tends to have members remain for life, simply to settle down and live as a single parent of a child he never wanted. He clearly has the potential to rebel with destruction, but simply doesn't. Both because it goes against his moral compass, as well as the fact that it's just not how he wants to carry himself anymore. And it's pretty apparent that the powers that be disagree with that decision. After all, the whole conflict of his narrative is an old Yakuza partner trying to blackmail him to get him back into the game. But even with all of that, he sticks to his convictions through it all, only ever caving once Karu is threatened with physical violence. I want to emphasize that he only ever gives in to protect someone else, not himself. Like I said, sometimes that's what rebellion looks like. Not shooting a gun for yourself, but rather taking a bullet for someone else. However, this arc does have one incredibly minor flaw, namely within the dialogue choices. As I said, Iwai has a soft spot for punks, but naturally that necessitates you acting like a punk in order to touch on that soft spot. As such, in order to get the most amount of points per question, you need to pick answers that are crass and uncaring, which really clashes with the protag's characterization everywhere else in the game. Especially since the core conceit of his character is that he isn't a punk, but rather just a kid who tried to do the right thing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like I said, this is super minor, especially since this is a problem with basically all of the confidants. Hell, it's basically a problem with every social link ever. In basically all of them, it feels like you're essentially only ever rewarded for telling people what they want to hear, which makes role-playing borderline impossible. However, it's especially predominant in Iwai's arc since the player character never acts like this elsewhere, which is why I bring it up here. Ultimately though, this doesn't detract from Iwai's core narrative in any way, and for me, it definitely stands as one of the more interesting and compelling confidants in the game. Next, let's look at Hifumi Togo. Now, I want to apologize in advance. I know that she's someone who has a lot of fans and that some people really love her, and I'm sorry, but I don't see it. Like, at all. Now don't get me wrong, she's not the worst by any measure, we've already established who actually is. But she's not only made out of unfulfilled potential, but also bland as hell. She suffers from the same problem Chihaya did, namely that she has interesting ideas and quirks here and there, but nothing that's ever really dived into in any meaningful or compelling way. The majority of her arc is her simply lamenting how she isn't taken seriously as a shogi player because she's a woman, but her garbage mother insists on trying to market her as a shogi idol, essentially selling her based on her sex, as well as realizing she's not as good as she thought she was after discovering she's been playing fixed matches. And you know what? That is a fucking killer premise. There is so much fertile ground there to examine any number of issues that not only Japan, but major swaths of the world at large are facing, as well as feeding back into the theme of rebellion. However, premise can only do as much for you as you can do with it, and they do basically nothing with it. Hifumi is a character with no real agency of her own, at least that we see on screen. She spends most of her arc merely talking about how hard it is to be her, how disrespectful her mother is, how dissatisfied she is with her position in the world, but never taking any serious action to remedy it. Instead, we, for some goddamn reason, decide to change her mom's heart, even though she really wasn't doing anything all that bad. Like, yeah, okay, fair, her mom's an asshole who's fixing matches against the wishes of Hifumi, but this is by no means the worst kind of parental abuse we see in the game. Hell, even calling it abuse feels more than a little disingenuous. From what little insight we get to her, she simply comes off as a self-obsessed stage mom who was doing what she seems to think was right for her child. Ironically enough, in a game that suffers all too often from making its villains too evil, here we have a character who isn't evil enough. Were it not for hearing the inner thoughts of her shadow, we would have no idea that she's actually pretty evil and doing some serious wrong, but we only hear those thoughts after deciding to change her heart. Prior to this, she was rude, kind of shitty, and really disrespectful to her daughter, but is that the bar we're setting for stealing someone's heart? This is also where the scale problem comes back in. Why did we, the Phantom Thieves, have to enact supernatural powers on this woman rather than someone else who is causing far more harm in the world? Why wasn't there a scene where we see Hifumi confront her mom and her mom acts completely bugfuck irrational to set up that stealing her heart is the only way? Or better yet, a scene where Hifumi just makes her see reason? And to what end do we wind up changing her heart? So Hifumi can have the right to try and win in a shogi match, a goddamn shogi match that she loses anyways. From where I sit, it makes no sense, cause I see this as Atlas passing up the chance to have Hifumi simply win the match regardless of what her mom says, just so they can have an excuse to shove another request in the game. To be clear, her losing is a good thing. It's a decent subversion of expectation. Like I said, a big part of her arc is her realizing that she isn't as great at shogi as she thinks she is. But she never grows as a result of that revelation because she never knew the fixed matches were happening. And when she finds out, she refuses to partake in them, with it ultimately culminating in her deciding to give up her rank and start as an amateur again. This is not something we ever see her not want to do. So her decision to do so has no real impact. And there's no evidence that us changing her mom's heart helped her reach this decision. Likewise, we never help her improve in any way we see, either in terms of her skills or general attitude, so it all begs the question of what the fuck are we doing? Are we really using our powers we could be using to save hundreds, if not thousands of lives, to help a girl who is already wildly successful become even more wildly successful in a way that she enjoys slightly more? And again, to what end does this all serve thematically? It doesn't feed back into the theme of rebellion, as she never, rebels, so that's out the window. We don't ever meaningfully examine or even see the sexism that exists in Japanese culture, much less the sexism skilled female competitors frequently have to overcome. The closest we get is Hifumi being marketed as an idol to boost her fame, but we only ever see other female competitors lash out at her for this. And we don't get any insight into how terrible parents can harm their children with their choices beyond seeing Hifumi be a little sad here and there. And even if we did, there'd still be several other arcs in the game that do the exact same thing with so much more relatability and bite. Hifumi is a character that doesn't grow, doesn't change, and has little to no agency. What's worse is that she's a character who's pretty boring to begin with. Yes, she has the God Empress persona she slips into during her games, and that is a nice touch, but much like Chihaya in her country accent, it's painfully underutilized and doesn't make up for the remaining 95% of the time where she's just a flavorless archetype. Just another face in an endless sea of quiet, introverted waifu bait characters. I don't like to say any story should have been something, but the reality of the matter here is that there's no problem that she couldn't have solved by simply standing up for herself. And that's what the story should have been. It should have been us building Hifumi up to have the confidence to stand up to an authority figure and live the way she saw fit. It should have been us motivating Hifumi to rebel, to incentivize her to grow. Instead, we got a story where some guy meets a girl and proceeds to fix all of her problems for her. Problems that barely qualify as problems in the first place, all accompanied by a completely forgettable mini-boss. At this point, it's a pretty well-known fact that she was originally conceived as a member of the Phantom Thieves before being left on the cutting room floor for whatever reason. But you know what? That's what she feels like. A character who is meant to have way more time, depth, and personality before someone somewhere said fuck it good enough and dropped her into the game. And it sucks, cause I like her design, goddammit. Oh, and of course, just like Chihaya, she has some of the most vital confidant abilities in the game, so I'll never be able to just skip her on replay. Fuck everything, dude. Wow, I did not realize how much I couldn't stand this arc until I started talking about it, holy shit. Finally, let's look at a character who is a complete piece of shit in the best way possible. Yuki Mishima. Mishima is introduced pretty early on as one of Kamoshida's victims. Narratively speaking, he basically exists as a stand-in for all of the male victims of Kamoshida's abuse, and he fills that role spectacularly. Early on, he's genuinely sympathetic, and given that he's the first person to figure out you're a phantom thief, he feels at least fairly smart and capable, especially when he starts to manage the fan site and essentially becomes your information broker. That being said, once you start up the confidant story and begin to get closer with him, well, have you ever had that thing where you saw someone who's kind of a social outcast and decided to be nice to them because, hey, we all need friends, right? And then you start talking with them and gradually realize that the reason they were socially outcast is because their entire personality constantly fluctuates between either being painfully awkward or a complete fucking monster? That's Mishima. This boy is clearly trying his best and we wouldn't want to be without him, but he's just so fucking hard to love. He is someone who has been pushed around for basically his entire life. He was constantly bullied as a kid, and after entering high school, wound up becoming one of the victims of Kamoshida's abuse. Normally in anime, this is the kind of background that would give way to someone standing up for justice and whatnot. And it kind of does, but in the worst way possible. Initially, he takes the responsibility he's been given very seriously. We helped him out of a truly dark situation, and for that he is incredibly grateful, so much so that he wants to help us prove to the world that we're here to act as a force for good. And for a while that goes great, as he manages the fan site and plays constant defense for us from anyone who tries to smear the Phantom Thieves. However, as the arc goes on and the fan site grows in popularity and power, it begins to go to his head. Before long, Mishima is thinking of us as essentially his personal task force and insisting that we go after people for things that are not only not crimes, but aren't even vaguely immoral. He goes from being a victim to a victimizer as he begins to take complete credit for everything we do while threatening people online in our name. It isn't until we confront his shadow in Mementos does he start to realize his fuck up and turn things around. However, by this point, his story has already done a lot of fascinating things. First off, it ties back into the theme of rebellion, but in a way that no other arc in the game does. Namely by pointing out that while rebellion is good, there are wrong ways to do it. Mishima is like Light Yagami, but without the charisma, confidence, or murder powers. His form of rebellion rapidly devolves from him wanting to help people to him wanting to control them because he believes that he knows best. and if he can't control them, then in his eyes, they are enemies. I mean, just look at how he starts to treat us when we start to go against his wishes. It's pretty revolting to see, but also not unprecedented if you look at the history of the real world. It does a killer job of serving as a reminder that if you don't prevent your rebellion from harming the innocent, then your rebellion isn't worth it. And that's a level of nuance I honestly wasn't expecting from this game. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't happy that it's there. Secondly, he has some of the best characterization in the entire game. He is an amazingly well-defined character with some deeply rooted and thought-out motivations and beliefs. It just so happens that that character is also a giant pile of garbage. Mishima is kind of the worst of all introverted male tendencies made manifest. Trust me, I speak from experience. This child says Keck at one point, send him to his room. It was honestly hard for me to watch at times, both in his confidant arc as well as the rest of the game. In the same way that Welcome to the NHK is hard to watch. It's one of those things that's difficult to see, not because you're embarrassed by proxy, but rather because you're counting all of the times you've been embarrassing in the exact same way. From his constant inability to pick up on social cues, his failed attempts at comedy, and his occasionally disgusting views on the people around him, his failings were as frustrating and gross as they were tragically relatable. Perhaps most of all though, Mishima is a fantastic case study in examining how someone who has been bullied can slowly but surely become a bully themselves. Mishima is someone who has undeniably been dealt a shit hand and endured some truly vile abuses. However, Mishima uses that as an excuse to just kind of generally despise the world. He thinks that just because some people have treated him like trash, that means he's allowed to treat the entire world like trash in return. It's a mindset that is remarkably easy to fall into if you're in a bad place. Again, trust me, I've been there. But even if it feels justified, the reality is that it's not. Trauma is tragic, and perceived weakness can be unbelievably hard to deal with. It's really easy to let that shit drag you down and make you into the worst version of yourself, to justify rejecting the world on the basis that it rejected you first. But the reality is that it didn't. The world is just sitting there, partially malicious and cruel, yes, but equally compassionate and caring. And to approach it as though only the former is all that there is toxic and self-defeating, and will only wind up making you all the more miserable. And we see that in how Mishima acts. All while clearly believing in his heart of hearts that he's a nice guy. But he's not. He's petty, self-loathing, and just kind of ugly in the most fundamental way. However, these failings aren't permanent. You can grow past them. By the end of his confidant route, Mishima has started to grow out of it and live up a little to the person you know he can be, going as far as to put himself in physical danger to protect someone he actually despises. And his final scene where he openly acknowledges all his faults and failings demonstrates a level of self-awareness and maturity that is honestly inspiring. Sure, he still has a long way to go, fucking Keck, but he's changing. Most importantly though, he's changing not because we stole his heart, but merely because we talk him through it and help him understand why his actions were kind of revolting. You know, kinda like that thing that other route should have done. Mishima is a bad person, but a good character on his way to being a good person. He starts out the arc obsessed with inflating the value of his contribution and making himself seem like a hero, but concludes realizing that being a hero has nothing to do with how he's perceived and everything to do with just helping people. I don't know if he's the best confidant in the game in terms of writing, but I will say he's definitely one of the ones that has kept me thinking the longest. And I'd say that counts for something. But I will say there's at least one character whose arc has kept me thinking a little bit longer. However, that will have to wait for next time, which will undoubtedly be soon because, man, I cannot wait to talk about this one. Continued in part 4. Hey y'all, Ryan here. Thanks for watching. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's currently helping me out on Patreon. People like Sam Natchison, Sherry Parr, Kevin Thurber, Keith, Black Mage App, as well as everyone else. Thank you guys so much. Anyways, thanks again for watching. I love you all. Peace.